Things are getting harder for many countries around the world as rising inflation touches every part of our economic lives. Central banks are trying to control inflation by increasing interest rates, but those moves are seemingly not bringing about the desired results. In South Africa, as with many African countries, the cost of living has skyrocketed, and we've seen the Reserve Bank of South Africa take a hawkish stance, and it has again raised the repo rate, which is the benchmark lending rate, by 75 basis points. Home loans, vehicle finance, and loans have risen right behind that decision. And this was the fourth consecutive increment following two 25 basis point hikes in November last year and in January of this year. This has taken the repurchase rates from 5.5% to 6.25%, and the prime lending rate in South Africa has increased from 9% to 9.75%. Joining me now from Johannesburg to take on this story is economist Phelisa Nkomo. Phelisa, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you for joining me.
Hi. Good afternoon.
Okay, please check your microphone. I think you might just be muted.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. I can hear you now. So let's start with a bit of the recommendations from the World Bank, which has actually said that countries should not be going forward with raising interest rates. Rather, they should look at easing border restrictions and improving employment opportunities. But we see that this sort of raising the interest rates to tackle inflation is an economic tool, is some kind of monetary tool that has been in the kitty, has been in the bag for a number of years. Do you think that tool has lost its power? Should we be looking towards what the World Bank is saying to address the inflation that's rising, which is then leading to the banks having to raise these very important and key interest rates?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I just want to, if you can fix up the sound. I can hear you, but I think the sound is capturing a better part of your question. But the point that I want to make right away is the fact that macroeconomic austerity measures, right, are not an appropriate tool to build vibrant economies. That's the first issue I want to make. And then the second point I want to make is the fact that the current interest rate increases across Africa in particular, and even globally, is that are meant to support supply side constraints and challenges. Okay, so it's actually called in economics. It's a cost pull. It's a cost push inflation, which you and I, who are sitting on the demand side of the economy, is actually, it has nothing to do with, right? But the interest rate, in fact, is going to affect us. But there are several lessons that we need to actually learn from this inflation, right? The general rise of prices. And then the first issue is that globalization, meaning where you have countries that are actually producing set specific products without other countries, with limited numbers of countries producing those products, actually signals that it's something that both the world economy needs to really put a spotlight into, right? So it means that we need to push for a much more decentralized, production of goods in particular. We've seen during the COVID where, for instance, countries had to wait on China to produce masks or to manufacture masks, right? And now we know that because of Ukraine and Russia and Russian war, is that there are several products unto which the world is actually waiting for, which is one of those is fuel, and the other one is wheat, and the other one is fertilizer, chemicals, etc., right? So what are that signals? It signals that our economies in the African continent are much more weaker, right? And that when there's a general rise of prices, they become even more vulnerable. But in fact, we could insulate our economies from this crisis, right? At the heart of it, what we just need to do is to be able to make it sure that, agricultural sector, boosting agricultural sector must be primary, because the general rise of the inflation has been driven by fuel and food, right? That's the first. I think there's also this opportunity present to us as well.
Okay.
Is that we need to shift away from a wheat-based diet, which has led into what we have a crisis now, which is amongst those, is the global food crisis.
Okay. Okay, so you bring up a number of interesting points. This dependency that a number of African countries have on Ukraine and Russia for wheat importation, which has then, of course, gone back to the pricing situation. So I want us to listen to the Reserve Bank of South Africa's governor, who had one or two things to say about the inflation and, of course, the repo rates rising as well. So let's take a look at what the governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa had to say, and we'll continue the conversation.
The second quarter of this year saw headline inflation breaching the target range and is expected to remain above it until the second quarter of 2023. By the fourth quarter of 2024, we expect headline inflation to revert to the midpoint of the target range on the back of declining fuel and food inflation. The forecast takes into account the policy rate trajectory indicated by the bank's quarterly projection model. As usual, the repo rate projection from the QPM remains a broad policy guide, changing from meeting to meeting in response to new data and risks. Against this backdrop, the MPC decided to increase the repurchase rate by 75 basis points to 6.25% per year with effect from the 23rd of September 2022. 3 members of the committee preferred the announced increase. 2 members preferred a 100 basis points increase. The level of the repurchase rate is now closer to the levels prevailing before the start of the pandemic.
And so that's the governor of the Reserve Bank of South Africa. They're talking about the decision of the MPC. And you've said that the macroeconomic tool that's being used right now has to be one that we relook. We need to look at these issues. But also you've noted that this is basically imported inflation. This is a conversation I've had with a number of people. And these are issues that are happening outside of our control and outside of the continent. So this is the third interest rate hike now. There was one in November last year and then January as well. And it doesn't seem like the MPC has said it's completely off the table for it to happen again this year. So let's look back at the previous ones. Had they had any of the desired effects before the latest MPC meeting?
That's a very good question, by the way, right? So, I mean, actually they haven't. In fact, that's why they feel compelled even right now to increase the interest rate. So one of the key issues, though, when central banks decide to increase interest rate, right, to manage inflation, more often than not, they are hoping that the fiscal policy should actually be stepping in at that point with some form of fiscal expansionary mechanism. Now, we know Africa, for example, has a crisis of unemployment, right? Has a crisis of poverty, has a crisis of social inequality. So in essence, one of the key issues that we must always look at is that when central banks take an austerity measure in the form of interest rates, what are the fiscal policy mechanisms that each country have introduced to make it sure that it insulates the citizens and the economy from the austerity measures, right? So if you read, for example, from the MPC statement, one of the key things that the governor is raising, he is saying that public sector spending has weakened. So what it means is that a fiscal policy that is meant to be an arbiter during a crisis, right, during an economic crisis, actually the spending is not happening. So we should be seeing, and as citizens in Africa, we should be seeing fiscal policy measures, both in the form of public infrastructure, in particular, increased public infrastructure spending. We should see our countries becoming construction sites from rail to road to bridges, right? To hospitals, to public schools, to public buildings. Because then in that way, you actually create a circulation of money supply. You increase money supply in the economy through public sector spending, okay? That's it. And then the fourth issue as well is that young people who have actually are the biggest in terms of exclusion in labor market participation could actually have the jobs, because the benefit about infrastructure jobs or public sector driven jobs is that they're labor intensive, right? So they use less machinery and technology. And in that way, you are able to draw in young people to be part of the construction sector. In that way, you're transferring skills, but also it means that families are going to have access to income. But this public sector intervention is not sufficient without dealing with food production issues, right? Because most of our countries, by the way, in Africa, at a national level, we are food secured, right? But at household level, we are food insecure, because it means that our agricultural sector is actually fixated with export, meaning that the government must earn export income instead of feeding its own citizens, which is when you feed your own citizens, the multiplier effects are massive, because agricultural sector does create jobs as well.
So I like the fact that you mentioned the household level, which is where my next question is taking us. We can see this at this economic decision level, policy making level, MPC level, but at the end of the day, this has real consequences for households across South Africa. So what are those consequences? How are households in South Africa now feeling, whether it's the direct or indirect consequences of seeing the repo rate rise once again? What's the effect for them?
Yeah. The starting point is that there's an inverse relationship, right, between interest rate increases and investment. That's the first issue. So what does that signal? It signals to you that any country in Africa, including South Africa, that has actually increased its interest rate to support or to manage inflation, it means that it's not going to be attracting any form of investment, right? That's the first issue. I think the second issue is that so those who want to expand their businesses are not going to be able to expand their business, particularly if they rely on credit in terms of expansion of their business. And obviously, the third issue is that consumers, right, are going to start losing money who are financing their lifestyle on the back of credit. Firstly, we know in South Africa, a lot of people cannot afford to buy their houses cash because their houses are then financed by banks. So it means that there's a certain percentage of your income that is just going to be taken away from you based purely on the back of interest rates, right? But fourthly is that consumers are not going to be spending because naturally in interest rate presents, it's a leakage to household income. The fourth issue is that it takes away any possibility of surplus in terms of income, right? Of course, people who benefit, and I know that there's always an argument that interest rate increases, support savings. That's true. That households who have a surplus, who are likely to have inherited, a bit of money from their, a trust funds from their parents, are likely to benefit from this. And in fact, they're probably not even bothered by the concerns for the increased interest rate. And the other group that gets to benefit from this is the banking sector, right? The banking sector will extend credit to several groups in the economy.
Phelisa. Okay, some technical network issues there, but hopefully we'll be able to get my guest back in just a moment. Looking at South Africa raising the repo rates, of course, as cost of living has gone up. What we've also seen, as my guest has noted, is that there is an inverse relationship between all of this, which means that the pressure is on for households in South Africa. And that was where I was going to go next. What can households in South Africa do to adjust in terms of spending money or even saving money in a situation like this? There, of course, is this conversation around the World Bank, which has said this is not the way to go. Stop raising interest rates. Rather, in fact, find ways to increase opportunities for employment and also ease restrictions across movement of goods and services. I think Phelisa is back with me. Phelisa, you were saying something in terms of the knockdown effects. You had listed at least 3 or so direct or indirect effects that come, consequences that come from the decision of the MPC to raise the repurchase rates. But I also want to get a bit more specific for that. What do you think South African households can do right now when it comes to the conversation around saving money, spending money? Because you mentioned, of course, they might be losing money. The conversation around credit, if your lifestyle or household is financed a lot by credit, you're going to be having a number of issues right now. So is there anything South African households can do to sort of maybe not insulate themselves, but reduce the amount of shock or reduce the amount in which they're feeling the pinch that's happening right now?
Yeah. I mean, to start with, by design, interest rates are often increased immediately. Okay, so it means that on the day that interest rates were increased, and all of us got SMSs from the banks to say, please be advised that interest rate is going to be increasing. So obviously, it means that South Africans have to really buckle up, and the buckle up is that they need to start reviewing their lifestyle from a spending perspective, right? Meaning that firstly, households would have to eat less, right? And that's going to actually affect the tourism industry, which was just picking up from the COVID recovery. The second issue, it would mean that people now need to start doing what you call carpooling in terms of petrol, right? So instead of driving alone a distance of about 50 to 60 kilometers to work, you need to start, lift clubs, right? Obviously, the third issue is that you need to have an increased food management conversation with children at home. That in fact, leftovers will not just be dumped in a dustbin, but in fact, they would have to be eaten. And obviously, thirdly, is that, as I said, that eat out is, but also spending on clothes, on consumption-based, goods would have to really decline. So the conversation about budgeting, both between parents and children, is actually going to be so important, because then it would mean that, and obviously, this is also going to even actually affect, by the way, what you call domestic service. We've seen it even during COVID. When people were starting to lose their jobs, is that they started actually, reducing their domestic service demands, meaning that they needed to clean their houses for themselves. So there's a sector that is actually going to lose jobs entirely. People are not going to require gardeners because they don't have surplus income, or they're not going to require, a domestic service to clean their house. If they would require, they would actually require domestic service intermittently instead of as a permanent service as they have. And we have a data that shows that actually during COVID, or when the economy, by the way, is shrinking, those who work in vulnerable sectors tend to lose their jobs, including those who are in the informal sector. Because people who are in the informal sector were selling vegetables, particularly because vegetables are actually perishable. Vegetables and fruit tend to lose out a lot more because the demand declines. People are buying less because they have less money. And so it would mean that those who are in the informal sector in particular are actually not be getting the consistent support they require.
Okay, so let's look at the possibility of more of these interest rate hikes coming. We've seen from the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, he said he's willing to raise the rates as much as necessary to get inflation under control. From the statement we saw from the Reserve Bank of South Africa's the governor, we saw a bit of that same stance, that we will continue to raise interest rates as much as we believe is necessary in order to tame inflation. So what do you think South Africa should be anticipating? That was the latest MPC meeting. There's still a few more before the end of the year. There's the potential that we might see another basis increase before the end of the year and even into early 2023. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, yes, there is absolutely no predictable answer that any economist can give, including central bank governors, by the way, right? Because everyone else is studying the data. But there's something that I must mention about the US Federal Reserve. At the time when South Africa had increased its interest rates, which is last in November, the most interesting thing that the Federal Reserve had said was that we're not going to increase it because we think that the current inflation that they were seeing, they were calling it transitionary inflation, which were driven by business tourism, not even leisure tourism, right? And the tourism industry. And they were saying they can't be then choking the American citizen on the back of one sector that is actually picking up, which was the tourism sector. But what we did in South Africa, we increased the interest rate irrespective. So we were not studying what was the driver of the inflation. Yes, it's true now that the Federal Reserve has actually increased it by 75 basis points. And there's something that they've also done, by the way, is that they've increased their food production, right, in America. And that's why you're seeing a decline in oil prices, a decline in cereal, a decline in wheat, because those are some of the basic foods. And even in maize. But what that signals is the fact that if countries at a national level could start looking at food production as being the primary issue, as also supporting and boosting the economy, so that you don't leave the economy or you don't expose the economy to external shocks that we've seen during the Russia and Ukraine war. It means that countries must actually start doing that now. And that's what America has done. So in essence, while they've increased this by 75 basis points, but in fact, they know that food inflation is not going to be the driver of future inflation because food production is increased. But in our case in Africa, we're not producing food, we're not producing fuel, but in fact, we've not seen any increase in food production.
All right, and I think it's a really important note that we end the conversation on, but I'll quickly just ask you this. Do you see, as you say, maybe it's difficult to predict, but I'm going to see if you have a crystal ball, any chances of possibly getting this inflation under control by the end of the year? What do you think?
Well, I mean, remember, this inflation is driven by Ukraine-Russian war, right?
Yes.
But we know that as well, Europe is going towards their very cold season. So there's a possibility that there's going to be a call by end of October for parties in Ukraine and Russia to get into the table to resolve this. Because all you just need peace between Ukraine and Russia, and the economy will stabilize, right? But at the same time, countries in Africa must use this crisis as an opportunity. They must start boosting their industrial capacity and making sure that they diversify goods that are actually being produced in their countries. And what this crisis also presents, it presents an opportunity for Africans to start trading with each other and deal with the issues of psychology and improve standards around production so that they can trust each other's goods. But there is really no predictability because I think the political economics of the war are unpredictable, and we actually don't know what really drives them, as even every day as we wake up and actually looking at the data in terms of the trade and markets.
All right, so it's something we'll continue to keep our eyes on. Phelisa Nkomo, thank you so much for joining me from Johannesburg, South Africa, and for being part of this conversation. And it is a lesson, an opportunity, as she said, for African economies and countries to learn from the situation and also find a way to insulate themselves from future incidences of course, imported inflation, as many economists we've spoken to have said. But right now, we continue to feel the pinch, and households across the continent, in South Africa, in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Ghana, are finding ways to continue with their daily activities, even as their pockets get lighter. You're watching Business Edge. When we come back, we get into the international business scene and give you the latest reports, particularly with Nord 1 and 2. European leaders think it's sabotage. The details in just a moment.